When historians describe San Francisco in 1906, they almost always begin above ground. They speak of the earthquake that struck at 5:12 a.m. They speak of the violent shaking the streets, splitting open the buildings, collapsing, and the fires that burned for 3 days. They speak of more than 400 blocks left in ruin, of a city reduced to ash, and of one of the greatest urban disasters in American history. That is the official image. The city above shattered and exposed. But there is another story, a quieter story, a story that did not begin in the daylight but beneath it. Because while the nation watched San Francisco rebuild, something else was happening below the rubble. And according to scattered notes, survey photographs, and fragments buried in municipal records, the reconstruction crews may have uncovered far more than earthquake damage. They may have uncovered a buried infrastructure that did not belong to the San Francisco we think we know. It began as a cleanup operation. Engineers were ordered to clear debris, remove collapsed structures, stabilize the ground, and prepare the city for reconstruction. The task was practical. Rebuild the streets, reinforce the foundations, determine whether the land could support a new metropolis rising from destruction. At first, the work beneath the surface seemed routine. Crews dug through fallen masonry, broken brick, fractured timber, and fire-blackened debris. But as they went deeper, the ground stopped behaving the way a ruined city is supposed to behave. They broke through layers that had not been exposed in decades. And beneath the rubble of 1906, they found something unexpected. Tunnels, chambers, passages. Not small utility voids, not crude mining shafts, but structures with scale symmetry and craftsmanship that did not seem to match anything in San Francisco's accepted historical timeline. Some of the passages were wide enough for a carriage. Some were lined with brick laid so precisely that even in grainy early 20th century photographs, the workmanship is unmistakable. Others appeared as arched corridors cut into the earth with such consistency that they looked less like improvised infrastructure and more like part of a deliberate organized system. And yet these spaces were absent from city maps. They did not appear in the public story of reconstruction. They barely appeared in the newspapers. And when they were mentioned in internal records at all, the language was strangely restrained. A few phrases appeared again and again. Pre-existing tunnels. Unexpected depth. Origin unknown. Officially, those phrases were later softened into ordinary explanations. Old sewer lines, forgotten mine shafts, misidentified earthquake damage, nothing unusual, nothing worth dwelling on. But the surviving photographs suggest something more difficult to dismiss. In those images, workers stand beside brick-lined passages that look overbuilt for anything Gold Rush San Francisco should have required. The arches are too clean. The alignments are too exact. The proportions feel too deliberate. And the deeper the crews went, the stranger the pattern became. At first, engineers tried to classify what they found in the simplest possible way: abandoned utilities, obsolete industrial remains, natural fissures opened by the quake. But the more they documented, the more the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some tunnels built on such a large scale? Why did certain sections of brickwork appear tighter, smoother, and more precise than what was typical of 19th century construction in California? Why did some corridors run beneath areas that were never documented as mining zones? And why did separate underground layers seem to follow the same geometric logic, as if they were all based on a plan no longer preserved in any archive? That may have been the strangest detail of all alignment. The layers beneath San Francisco did not appear chaotic. They appeared ordered. Post-earthquake debris, pre-earthquake foundations, Victorian-era construction, and whatever lay beneath them all seemed to follow the same grid, the same directional logic, the same hidden grammar. That is not how cities usually grow. Different decades bring different builders. Different builders bring different methods. Infrastructure shifts, drifts, and overlaps. It becomes messy, improvised, uneven. But beneath parts of San Francisco, the buried layers seem to echo one another. Tunnels aligned with deeper tunnels. Drainage routes followed older trajectories. Passages from one era appeared to mirror passages from another. It was as if generation after generation had built over something older, adapting it, inheriting it, maybe not even fully understanding it. And then the excavations went deeper. Beneath the expected brick and timber of the Victorian city, workers began encountering structures that did not resemble ordinary 19th century construction at all. Some chambers were perfectly vaulted, with curves so consistent they seemed engineered to a higher standard than anything officially associated with early San Francisco. Some walls were so tightly joined that later descriptions claimed you could barely slide paper between the seams. And in some of the deepest sections, the crews encountered something even stranger. The tunnels were filled with hardened mud and compacted sediment. Not loose soil, not casual debris, but dense layered material packed so firmly that crews reportedly had to spend days clearing just a small section. In some places, the mud had filled entire chambers, as if these spaces had either been submerged long ago or deliberately entombed. That raised another uncomfortable question. If these were ordinary tunnels, why were they buried this way? There is no simple historical explanation for why underground passages of that scale in those locations would be packed with compressed sediment to such depths. And that is where the mystery begins to shift, because this is no longer just a story about hidden tunnels. It becomes a story about burial, about something built, covered, built over, and then forgotten. The survey photographs from 1906 and 1907 only deepen that impression. They show workers standing in passages so large, the men themselves look reduced by comparison. They show vaulted spaces, carefully laid brick, and drainage systems that appear too sophisticated for the rough and rapid urban growth usually associated with Gold Rush San Francisco. But perhaps the most unsettling detail is not what appears in the images. It is what barely appears in the written record. Official reconstruction reports mention little. Some drawings omit the deepest tunnels entirely. Certain features are collapsed into vague phrases like earlier construction or pre-existing utilities, even when the photographs suggest something far more elaborate. That silence matters, because if the deeper layers truly belong to ordinary documented infrastructure, why not describe them in full? Why not measure them carefully, map them clearly, and preserve them as part of the city's engineering history? Instead, the deeper the record seems to go, the more indistinct the language becomes. And then came the features that pushed the mystery even further. Some workers describe giant circular shafts descending into the earth, too symmetrical to be natural, too deep to be casually dismissed, and too precisely cylindrical to fit comfortably into the category of old wells or sinkholes. Some were wide enough for multiple men to descend side by side. Others narrowed gradually, almost like ventilation shafts, service access points, or mechanical conduits for a system whose purpose was no longer understood. Private descriptions referred to them not as accidents of geology, but as engineered vertical passages. Then there were the support structures. Massive brick pillars appeared in places where Victorian engineers would have had no obvious reason to build them. Foundation walls extended beyond the footprint of buildings officially known to have stood above. Some supports seemed designed for loads heavier than anything visible at street level. And then, perhaps strangest of all, came reports of metal rails embedded in the floors of tunnels that were thought to predate San Francisco's rail systems. The official explanation was predictable: mining cart tracks, forgotten industrial remnants, later intrusions into older spaces. But even that does not fully account for the pattern, because the rails did not appear random. They appeared organized. They followed routes. They suggested planning. Not the scattered remains of incidental labor, but the logic of a transit-like system beneath the city. A city beneath the city. And once that possibility enters the frame, the entire story changes. Because now the question is no longer whether isolated tunnels existed. Many cities have tunnels. The question is whether what was uncovered in 1906 was part of something larger, a network, a buried system, an earlier layer of urban order that official history never fully recorded. And if that possibility was recognized even quietly, it might explain what happened next. The tunnels were sealed, passages were filled, access points were blocked. Deep sections were buried again beneath earthquake rubble and new construction. Officially, this was explained as a matter of safety. Prevent collapses, secure unstable zones, rebuild quickly. And to be fair, those are reasonable explanations. A city in crisis does not always stop to investigate every anomaly. But the pattern remains difficult to ignore. Again and again, the sections that seem to have disappeared first were the most elaborate ones. The cleanest chambers, the deepest shafts, the most puzzling corridors, the places that challenged the accepted timeline most directly. That does not prove a cover-up, but it does suggest discomfort, and sometimes discomfort leaves a stronger trace than confession. By the final months of the reconstruction excavations, the tone of the surviving notes appears to change. Early descriptions are practical and direct. Later ones become shorter, vaguer, more cautious. It is as if the ground had opened just enough to reveal something no one quite knew how to explain, and once seen, it had to be pushed back into darkness. That is what gives this story its enduring power. Not simply the tunnels themselves, but the pattern around them, the scale, the alignment, the mud-filled chambers, the unexplained shafts, the rail systems, the sudden vagueness in the reports, the selective sealing, the photographs that survive without a single clear official narrative to contain them. Taken individually, each detail can be explained away. Together, they begin to feel less like coincidence and more like a glimpse of an older layer of reality beneath the modern city. And that is where this story touches something larger than San Francisco. Because if one city can be rebuilt on top of buried infrastructure that no longer fits the story told about it, then what about other cities? What lies beneath London, Paris, Istanbul, Mexico City, Tokyo? How many times has disaster demolition excavation or war briefly opened the ground and exposed something difficult to classify? How many times have those glimpses been recorded, minimized, and covered over in the name of practicality? Maybe what happened in San Francisco in 1906 was ordinary. Maybe it was misunderstood infrastructure from a chaotic young city. Maybe every strange feature has a conventional explanation waiting to be rediscovered. But maybe not. Maybe the real significance of the 1906 excavation is not that it proved the existence of some lost civilization in any final sense. Maybe its significance is that it exposed the limits of the official story. For a brief moment, the earthquake tore open the surface and revealed that the city was layered more deeply than its public history allowed. The workers saw it. Some photographed it. Some described it. Then the rebuilding continued. The rubble went back in. The streets returned. The official narrative held. but the fragments remain. A handful of photographs, scattered notes, a pattern of omission, a buried geometry beneath a city that was never supposed to have one. And that leaves us with a question that still has not gone away. What was really found beneath San Francisco in 1906? Was it simply forgotten infrastructure? Or was it evidence that modern cities may rest on older foundations, foundations inherited, reused, and then quietly folded into history until no one remembered where they came from? Maybe we will never have a complete answer. But every time the ground opens, even a little, the same possibility returns. That beneath the streets we know, there may be another map, another plan, another memory, one that was never meant to remain visible for long. Thanks for listening. And if this story stayed with you, there are many more cities with buried layers, forgotten structures, and unanswered questions beneath their streets. This may have been San Francisco, but it may not have been only San Francisco.